Hey everyone, before we get into today's podcast, I wanted to share that InfoQ's International Software Development Conference, QCon, will be back in San Francisco in the US from October 2nd to 6th. QCon will share real world technical talks from senior software development practitioners. You'll learn about their successes, their failures, and you'll also see how to apply emerging patterns and practices to address some of your challenges too. Learn more at QConSF.com. I'll be there running the platform engineering track, and I hope to see you there. Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Bryant, and today I'm joined by Roi Ravhon, co-founder and CEO at Finout, and we discuss the topic of FinOps. I've increasingly been bumping into this concept, from content created by the FinOps Foundation, from sessions at the recent QCon Amsterdam and QCon New York events, and it was also mentioned by InfoQ editor Stefan Wiggers in our recent Cloud and DevOps trend report. I've read several excellent articles by Roi, and so I wanted to reach out and learn more. In this podcast, we cover a range of topics, starting from what FinOps is. We then move on to how to adopt FinOps, both from a technical in the trenches and also a leadership perspective. And then we explore signs of successes. This includes the ability to understand your applications and systems unit economics, which ultimately helps with creating architecture guide rails, scaling systems, and ultimately generating more revenue for your company. So welcome to the InfoQ podcast, Roi. Could you introduce yourself to the listeners, please?
Of course. My name is Roi. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Finout. I live in Israel, started my career like many Israeli entrepreneurs in the Israeli intelligence units, then spent a lot of time in the high-tech industry and now leading Finout, which is a cloud cost management company.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we're hearing more and more about FinOps. It's popped up in several of our trend reports. For listeners that haven't heard about this, can you share your definition, your view of what FinOps is, what it means, and what the impact would be?
Yeah, so FinOps is kind of a new name to something we always knew and knew how to do from the beginning of the cloud. But a couple of people named J.R. Stormont and Mike Fuller that works in Atlassian worked on codifying FinOps concept and methodology. And eventually, there's a whole book and the whole foundation behind FinOps. But if I have to sum it up into one sentence, it's to get engineers to be more aware of their spending and eventually getting every single person in the organization all around how much money does it cost to run the application in the cloud. So it's not only about saving money, it's about education, it's about making more money out of each dollar that we're spending and allow us to grow healthy and make sure we get the bang for our bucks that we pay.
Fantastic. Roy. A bunch of things I'd love to dive into as we talk. I think the first thing I often hear to folks is how does it relate to DevOps? And I think it's purely because it sounds the same, right? FinOps, DevOps. What's your thoughts there and how the two things play against each other?
So if you look back at DevOps, 10 years ago, and we would try to get engineers to be responsible for their code in production, people would look at us like we're mad, right? So,
Yes.
I'm coding and throwing it in the operation teams, and I hope that everything will be okay. And I'm not going to be the one waking up at night if it's not. And then DevOps came in, and DevOps, it's a movement that evolved into a role that essentially allowing engineers to have all the tools that they need in order to be responsible for the code in production and make sure it's getting there. So I think FinOps is drastically different, but still lies the same set of basic concepts. So if I would talk to you 3 years ago, when I would tell you that engineers are going to be responsible for their cost of their service in production, and you're going to get alert when they're starting to lose their cost model and the unit economics are breaking, no one would believe. But now we start to see this more and more for reality. FinOps, the same treatment as DevOps in many organizations, from something, one initiative of someone that tries to pull it off into dashboard of cloud cost and engineers actually caring about the cost of their service, the same as they care about SLA now. And TVs that are showing tables and gamification of what's the most costliest service or whatever. So it really starts to become a fundamental shift within the organization relationship with cloud financial management. And suddenly not something that only finance cares about and starts to nag constantly about what's happening, into something, it's a cultural change that we see lots of organizations going through, which is very similar to what DevOps did.
Yeah, I love it. That was culture. We have columns, the acronyms in DevOps, right? And the C in columns is very much related to culture. So yeah, I love it. You mentioned a bunch of things there. What do you think is the main challenge that drives the adoption of FinOps?
So we see different organizations behaving very differently when it comes to FinOps adoption. So, it can be an enterprise that is now like migrating to the cloud and, continue with their digital transformation roadmap. And something that is often discovered is that they're not really adapting to the cloud, rather building on-prem infrastructure on AWS. And like once doing that, they start to figure out that things are a lot more expensive than they hoped and benchmark, because like they're not properly using cloud technologies as they should have. So this is like the first step, and then they need to adapt, and like someone higher up gets all annoyed. They're like, what's going on here? Like we need to start taking cloud costs seriously, and someone needs to be responsible for it. But it can also be coming from the bottom. So like engineers that were exposed to FinOps, and they have that initiative of like, hey guys, I think we're spending too much money on the cloud. We can be more efficient. Looking at the company, looking at the P&L, coming from finance, like cloud costs for lots of the software companies is like the biggest expense that they have in the cost of sale, right? The second biggest expense of the company after salaries. And for years, we were thinking of cloud costs as, just a tax, something we have to do, something we need to spend. And once the organization starts to change the conversation from spend into investments, it starts to get a lot clearer that we need to measure the ROI. So we're investing money in cloud, and we need to measure how much money we get back out of that. So it can be someone from the executive team, and it can be like as low as an engineer that got exposed to it and really cares about what's happening. So we see FinOps starting, with all shapes and sizes, but it's really fascinating to see that evolvement.
Yeah, that is fascinating, right? I hadn't thought about the bottom up or top down, but we saw the same thing in DevOps, as you said, right? In terms of like sometimes it was a C-level kind of transformation project, sometimes it was very much like, to your point, developers like getting sick of like throwing stuff over and getting it thrown back. They wanted to like take more charge of it. Fantastic. Like, I'd love to explore why FinOps is getting more popular now. You sort of hinted that DevOps like what been 10, 15 years around. FinOps, I've heard the last few years. I bumped into actually Simon Wardley. I think was the first person that kind of put it on my radar. I always look at what Simon's doing because he's like totally ahead of the curve, right? And he was talking about FinOps, or the concepts at least, like pretty much when DevOps was becoming a thing, right? I know some of the early work he did with the Zimke platform and other things, he was always thinking about the cost model, as you've talked about there. But why do you think the zeitgeist has captured, the FinOps movement now? Is it the end of the free money? Is it the end of the zero interest rates, the VC dollars drying up, right? Or is it some other thing that I'm not seeing?
Yeah, I think it's a combination, right? To be honest, we see FinOps in 2022, 2023, like jumping off the roof. Just look at the Google Trends graph, or like how much people are looking at FinOps, see what's happening to the FinOps Foundation, like its members and community that is evolving. It's amazing. We see, I think most of the Fortune 50 is now part of the FinOps Foundation as members. So it's starting from a niche kind of thing that when we raised the Series Seed for FinOut like 2.5 years ago, we went through VCs and we tried to convince them that FinOps is actually like a concept. That people care about it. Like we went through LinkedIn and searched for everyone that has the FinOps title in its name. And like in the last couple of years, like we see, FinOps have become a profession. It's became a really huge thing. We just came back from the FinOps X, which is like the yearly conference by the FinOps Foundation. Like 1,200 people traveled all the way to San Diego, like to participate and exchange thoughts, and starts to get into a huge community that really fundamentally changes like the way that we approach that. So I think it's a combination of both more awareness. So people are aware that cloud is expensive and they want to treat it with the desirable respect, and also like downturn, and as you mentioned, like the era of free money is over, and once we did everything we can in order to like we went through layoffs as an industry and like a cutbacks whenever possible, and this is the immediate term kind of thing. But if we're selling a product that is like low margin, there's very little we can do without improving that margin, and like firing more salespeople is not going to help. It's going to do like the exact opposite kind of thing. So we then need to start like to react to reality. So we need to understand the actual like underlying infrastructure. How much money do we spend on everything? How do we measure lifetime value of our accounts? And it's just not the money they're paying, it's how much money it costs us to hold them. And I think that more and more companies got to the realization that, cloud cost is just something that we have to handle. And I don't see it going away like anytime soon.
Fantastic, fantastic. As we head more into sort of some of the solutions now, what would be a typical kind of case study or a typical trigger for an organization adopting FinOps?
It's something that is so in multiple organizations. When talking to finance, they will continue to run a complicated analysis on P&L and FP&A kind of processes. And at some point, they tend to discover that cloud cost is growing unproportionally to the revenue. You can hide it as much as you want, but eventually economy of scale is not just kicking in like without you doing anything about it. Like if you continue to spend, you continue to not care about anything you're doing, you can't hope to wake up one day and figure out that unit economics are okay. So we saw this as a trigger from an organization that, they really understood that something is not working, and cloud cost became a board level discussion with many of the companies. And it's like not something we can continue to ignore. It's something that we have to like start to face reality. And Flexera ran an amazing server in 2023, and like cloud cost was the biggest problem for both enterprise and SMB. So it's like it's no longer security or no longer fear of the unknown. Like, this is the number one priority for many enterprises and SMBs out there, and just something that need to be solved.
Fantastic. How do organizations typically go about solving these problems? And I'm thinking back to my DevOps days where people wanted to buy DevOps in a box. They still do, right? Sell me some DevOps, right? Do they want to buy FinOps solutions? And how does that actually relate? You mentioned culture already. What should they be doing as well?
Yeah, so I 100%, we constantly get on calls with customers who just want to buy FinOps. And we're like, great, but what do you want to do? Like, what do you want to achieve? And now I want my engineers to care about cost. And we're like, great, buying a tool is not going to help you with that. Like, let's start to work on the culture and like, let's talk again in a couple of months. But there's a bunch of magic solutions we can do right on cloud spend. So you can buy a tool that's going to optimize your commitments. You can buy a tool that can help you, right size and identify waste. You can buy a tool that creates visibility in the organization. So there's a bunch of like different things we can do, or buy like a FinOps in a box. But eventually, it's not something we can do without proper organizational alignment. So people need to care about cloud cost. And going back to the FinOps Foundation and FinOps X, I think lots of the tracks that were about like, how do we get engineers to take action? How can we like encourage that culture within the companies? It's one of the biggest tasks that the companies have to go through. Like we can give the best tools, the best dashboarding, the best reporting, anomalies, alert, whatever. But like if there's not going to be anyone that's going to care about, if engineers are not going to be responsible for what they're doing, and they will look at FinOps, as another like bug that they need to get off their shoulder when it's constantly asking them about stuff that they did, it's just not going to work. Because eventually, like engineers in the modern shift left era, engineers have the power. Right. So if someone from finance is going to ask engineer, like, why did you buy those new free letters service from AWS and whatever, so they can continue to use any technical mumbo jumbo. They can throw in like scary words into the conversation, and finance can't really deal with it unless we start to measure a metric that we both agree on. Like 5% increase at AWS can be good regardless of our revenue growth. And if we don't have a standardized way of agreeing on that, and if we don't have, that built-in collaboration, engineers really takes finance questions into consideration, and finance believes engineers with what they're doing, like it's going to be extremely hard to do anything just by buying a tool.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Sorry. And something I heard you say there is it's always that collaboration, and we have seen, rightly or wrongly, the role of the DevOps engineer pop up, right? And we all sort of say it's not really a role; it's more of a philosophy, set of practices. But it is what it is, right? Are you seeing kind of FinOps roles popping up? Is there like an equivalent FinOps engineer? Like, can I legit look on LinkedIn for that kind of role these days?
100%. So really the same as DevOps, right? So it's a philosophy that have evolved into a role. Same as DevOps, you're going to guess like 10 different FinOps engineer, what their day-to-day life, you're probably going to get 15 answers, but it's running kind of the same set of tracks. And FinOps is evolving, as I mentioned before, like in lots of enterprises. Like it started as a cloud center of excellence, have evolved into FinOps. Also important to note that FinOps is not the like only philosophy on how to run cloud costs, the same like as DevOps and SRE. So there's AWS has their own things. There's a bunch of like a smaller kind of less popular books that were written on the subject. So some kind of like cloud financial engineer, some will call it. There's a bunch of different wording here, but like FinOps is start to get adopted as like the most common trend, yet not the only one.
Interesting. And having a smile there when you mentioned about like 15 different engineers, 15 different roles, right? Because I totally relate to that. When DevOps was a thing, everyone did very different things. But we did also align around, say, like what became the DORA metrics or the Accelerate metrics. That was kind of often your North Stars, right? So lead time to delivery, MTTR, et cetera, et cetera. Are there common metrics emerging around this FinOps concept as well?
Some are easier to track than others. As an example, usually lots of FinOps engineers are going to look at their coverage, like a percentage. So how much of my infrastructure is running on demand versus how much is committed. Like this is a golden number that each organization can tweak on its own, but it's a metric that FinOps can be measured on. Issue with cloud cost is that it's supposed to be relative to the business, right? So like unlike MTTR, which is like we can define just one number and we should expect to reach it, like regardless of how much money do we sell. In cloud cost, it's not the right kind of metric, because if we're spending $1 million on AWS, it's good. $2 million is good, $500,000 is good, like depends on what. So where we see the North Star in lots of FinOps practices, and like this is the dream that many FinOps teams are striving for, is what's called unit economics or unit cost. It's not interchangeable, but like for the sake of this conversation. So for example, we don't want to see how much money we spend on AWS. We want to measure how much money we spend per event, click, transaction, gig, user, like something that is tangible. And going back to like engineers and finance relationship, so like 5% increase in AWS, again, is kind of meaningless. But if we know that we spend 5% more to AWS, but our unit cost remains the same, so it's okay, right? It's perfectly viable. And like looking at long-term budgeting, it's also like a huge concept here that can really fundamentally change the way that companies are approaching that. Because again, like if we budgeted $2 million a year for AWS, but in the middle of the year, we signed a huge customer, that just doubled our revenue and something we never planned and budgeted for. So we need to buy more infrastructure in order to handle that. So we're going to get off budget. So like, who is accountable for this budget, right? So like, should we as engineering sacrifice stuff from our playground and innovation budget in order to like deal with this customer? So things starts to get weird here. And what we see like the most advanced companies are doing is budgeting on gross margins and budgeting on unit economics rather than the actual numbers. So, engineers do whatever you want as long as we keep 80% margin, whatever you need. So like build, change cloud, change technologies, like do whatever you want. It's okay to pay more money for the cloud cost because like you need to support more infrastructure. This is on you, but you're targeted on margin. If you're going to hit that margin, you're going to fire a bunch of people. You're going to lose headcount. There's something that we actually see, like lots of organizations start to condition cloud efficiency with headcount. Like you can either spend money on cloud or spend money on headcount, but you can do both. So you want to hire more people? Great. Get more efficient.
So what's the key indicator that folks have successfully adopted FinOps? Is it the development of understanding of the unit economics?
So I don't think there's a singular point in time where like people can say, all right, we did FinOps. So FinOps is always evolving because cloud is always evolving. There's always new stuff to do and always new technologies. And unlike data centers, cloud environments are like extremely volatile and constantly changing. And AWS is releasing new pricing or a new service or a new tool. And suddenly we bought Datadog and we bought Snowflake and Mailchimp and Twilio and Akamai and Stripe. Like there's so many more solutions that get into this problem as well. And we continue with our digital transformation, continue to moving CapEx to OpEx. Like the organization changed constantly. When you can say that you're doing DevOps, you succeeded with DevOps, it's not a real like tangible point in time, rather like an ongoing kind of philosophy and journey that the organization is going through.
Fantastic. And I know you and I chatted the other day about a lot of things around, say, chargebacks and unit economics along the journey. What would be a typical journey? Because I think people, they can probably see the unit economics argument, but it might take them a while to get there, right? Like, what's some wins along the way on the journey that people typically see when adopting FinOps?
You mentioned that a second ago, like showback and chargebacks are one of the biggest challenges for enterprise running on like a multi-cloud, multi-service kind of environment. So companies are usually reliant on AWS tags in order to run proper showback and chargeback. And unfortunately, like this model is very easily breaking. So it's enough that we run like an organizational change. So like one group is moving from, one business unit to another. And now we have new resources that are not tagged and tagged on the future looking. And even if we build the entire thing, now we adopted Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is another level of abstraction on the cloud cost. And like we don't have anything. And we went through a multi-cloud, multi-service. So showback is like one of the most fundamental like concept that we see with lots of organizations. It's one of like the first items that our organization wants to reach. Like we want to allow each engineering director to be the budget owner for their spend. As a centralized IT team, we want to charge back our like internal customers with their data consumption. As a finance organization, we want to map our cost centers, understand our profitability, even what's COGS and what's not COGS, like what was a part of the infrastructure that was responsible for actually like relying on supporting the product. It's a fairly difficult question running on a multi-cloud, multi-service, especially with Kubernetes kind of environment. So we usually see those sets of challenges, as one of the firsts, but afterwards, continue to get really, really dependent on the organization. So some will go all the way like in automating changes and optimizations. A lot will struggle with getting engineers to take action. So like, for example, we found an idle database. Great. Can we turn it off? Who is the one responsible for even like giving us the thumbs up? And so finding those organizational alignments is very hard. Like the bigger the organization is and like the more mature they are with their consumption, meaning that they're running for so many years without anyone like attributing stuff. And budgeting and forecasting is also a huge theme in issue. Like when running and working with AWS, we usually closing some sort of like enterprise agreement discounts agreements with them. So we need to understand how it's going to be, like what's our consumption is going to look like for the next 3 years. We can barely like estimate how we're going to end the month, and now we need to think like 3 years in advance. So like what's the forecast, what's the best pricing we can get, on which services we want to fight hard with the CSP to get the discount, and which services we don't really care about. So there's a bunch of stuff here that are getting into that concept, and it's getting multiple different stakeholders in the organization. So from finance to engineering to FinOps to procurement to DevOps to RevOps, there are so many people working on that, and it really depends on like the maturity of each on what's going to be the next challenge that the FinOps team is going to tackle.
Fantastic. Yeah, great overview there. Like touch every aspect of the business, right? Which is fantastic. If we dial it back for our listeners now, probably, the architects, the senior technical folks, and we have listeners that are developers, listeners that are platform folks. Who typically does the work in the org? Right, because you mentioned there, like some of the stuff more cost of goods is like more dynamic spend, right? Developers making choices about what they're doing, but some of the stuff is just platform, right? You have to have it running because like that's a steady state fixed cost effectively. How does that dynamic typically work with developers and platform engineers? Who does the work? Who kind of is accountable, I guess, for some of that?
So going back again to the culture and collaboration. So if like a FinOps engineer is going to work on allocating their entire organizational spend, probably not something that can actually work. And like we need the support of the engineers, like they know the system best. We need support of the architect. They know like what's responsible for everything. And like it's not always, as trivial as we hope it to be as well. So maybe it's an entire Kubernetes namespace or an instance that can be allocated fully to a team or a customer. But what's happened on shared databases? What's happened on like shared storage? So when we start to get into those kind of more complications, it starts to get harder and harder. And we just need to get someone in an organization that really understand what's happening in order to create that kind of collaboration. It's usually like a multi-tier, multi-level approach. So we start with something small, we start with just one department, and then we continue with our allocation ranges. So like we see the more advanced companies on the 90 plus range, getting to 100 is extremely difficult. And like based on the maturity level, we start to increase our allocated range of the cloud spend.
I'd love to dive into some tools, and I appreciate, you can't buy FinOps in a box, but we'd love to cover your opinion on some of the tools. But before we do, is there any case study that jumps to mind of like, say, a typical, and I appreciate that's quite hard in itself, but a typical company adopting FinOps, the kind of like, maybe you can even talk about a case study, an actual named case study. I'd love to understand and help the listeners understand like what a journey looks like, particularly for an enterprise here, a big-ish company.
Without taking specific names or technology, I can talk about like in general stuff that we see with some of the companies that we're working with. So usually for the bigger companies, they always have more than one cloud. So they have a primary cloud, they have a secondary cloud, plus of the time, third and fourth and fifth clouds, even or we see like lots of companies running it down that track. And now they're using like a one data warehouse, they're using one observability system, they're using one CDN, and even the question of how much money are we spending on our cloud environments is a huge thing, and the first thing that they're trying to solve. So how much we spend on storage, how much we spend on compute, how much we spend on like a cross-cloud Kubernetes. So all of these are like fundamental questions to the business that are very hard to answer without us helping companies to achieve that kind of level of visibility. Then the cost allocation challenge is usually the second one that companies are trying to tackle. So oftentimes like the centralized IT department is the one that buying those FinOps tools, because they're the one that are spending their budget on cloud spend and technology. And because they can't use proper showback and chargebacks in order to like relieve that budget from their quota and like assign it to the actual teams, it's a organizational political kind of thing, but it's still a major challenge. And eventually what you start to see is that lots of finance departments has endless questions on what's happening, right? And like how much you pay for this team, how much you pay for this customer, what's the margin, what's our costs, what's our whatever. And lots of our case studies are focused on giving finance a proper organizational picture and like allowing to give those numbers without having to spend like a week, a month creating complicated Excel sheets that it just never ends. And obviously, almost every company that you work with also wants to lower down their cloud spend, right? It's a trivial thing to do and to want. And we see great success with companies that never paid any attention to cloud spend, getting all the way to 45, up to 50 even a percentage of cloud savings. It really depends on their maturity. And the average save that we have at companies, even the mature ones, are like over 30%. So there's always stuff to find. There's always like changes that need to be made. And with progressing through the maturity model of the FinOps Foundation, you're getting better and better and better at what you're doing. And while doing that, you can save a lot of money. And then the challenge comes to like keep it down and keep your unit economics effective. But it's something that needs done. It's constant monitor. But this is like a common FinOps adoption story that we see in the market a lot.
I think so. That's super useful. And I don't know if you want to name any names or focus perhaps more on the categories, but I'd love to know like what tooling exists. And I was looking around, you know, I've chatted a little bit before. There's things obviously like sort of the visibility aspect, observability. There's the data analysis, and there's like how do we handle cost projection and capacity planning, all that kind of good stuff. Like, have I roughly got those categories right? Do you think there's interesting tools that are worth mentioning in that space? I'd lean a little bit more towards the open source if that's possible as well. But I'd love to get your thoughts on what kind of tooling is the really de facto tooling in those spaces.
So we start to see the line blur from one tooling to another. It's common kind of thing to do in a crowded space, but we can differentiate the tools like roughly into three groups. One is visibility, so solutions like FinOut, like a Cloud Health, like a Cloudability, like a Cloud Zero. So those are like the tools that helps with showing and allocating cost to the organization. Then there's the optimization side of things. So there's a bunch of like different techniques on how to optimize cloud spend. So you can see solutions like Prosper Ops or Zesty that helps with commitments, CloudFix that helps with remediation of changes, Granulate that Intelbot that like plays around with the IO scheduler of the instance in order to like achieve high level of efficiency. So there's a bunch of those. And then there's the point solution. So, solution that just like solve one thing and does it well. Most prominent one will be KubeCost that also has an open source version, like on how to analyze Kubernetes cost. In terms of open source in general, also there is one kind of initiative throughout the world. It's called OpenCost, which is like mainly sponsored by KubeCost and being attributed by multiple different providers that is working on like creating proper open source kind of tool for cost management. Fairly limited, but not widely used, but it's still there. There's the new initiative by the FinOps Foundation, which is super interesting. It's called Focus Group, which tries to create a standard of cost reporting across different vendors. So something that is very hard now for organizations that are not using solutions like FinOut is to create this kind of schema of like what's cost, what's compute, what's storage, what's whatever, and doing like multiple different times. And then like they need to speak with a specific terminology of each cloud vendor to get their specific reporting. Create ETL processes in order to to map it all the way so that they can actually reach one Excel and ask one question. So the focus group is working on creating that kind of standard, which is super interesting. And I'm really looking forward to see the results. It's something that I think the entire industry is waiting. There's also lots of political kind of things. So
Yeah, no doubt.
AWS is currently out of this program. So our AWS is going to get in, they're going to contribute, who's even the one that contributed, like, are they actually going to implement it or not? Like, there's going to be an interesting couple of years now with the adoption of that. But as a community, this is something that everyone demands. And I think it's going to be extremely interesting.
Reminds me a little bit actually of open telemetry, or like the open telemetry in the observability space, right? For a while, everyone was like, I remember that open telemetry was merged of two different competing foundations or organizations, and then like you said, other clouds going to adopt it. But now everyone's like, let's not compete on the protocol, let's not compete on the schema, let's compete on the actual tooling, right? So that's interesting to see, like the maturity of the FinOps space is moving towards that by the sound of it.
Yeah, so the FinOps Foundation is organized under a subsidiary of the Linux Foundation. So I think there's lots of lessons learned and the proper people there that can actually help with achieving those kinds of standards. I think the industry deserves that. Another concept that I personally would really like to see resolved is the entire carbon emission issue. So not the cloud providers are not like really reporting it well. And even if it does, it's not standardized and can easily change and are not easily justified. And I really like the FinOps Foundation as well, trying to create that kind of standard of cloud emission reporting that I really want to see like the hyperscalers actually implement. So you can consume cost and you can consume like emission, which is not necessarily the same thing. So it's also going to be extremely interesting, I think.
That's fantastic. Like, there's probably a whole new podcast we could do there on the emissions stuff, because that's come up several times in our trend reports. The listeners are really interested about impact their organizations are happening. So I'll leave it there. That's fantastic. Thank you for that. That's fantastic kind of insight into the dynamics between those things. You've mentioned the FinOps Foundation a couple of times. I'd love to dive into them a bit more. You mentioned it's a Linux foundation. Like, I've done a lot of work with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF, and they have done some amazing kind of like skeletons and foundation work around organizing governance for projects, that thing going forward. There's definitely a lean in the CNCF more more towards end users now, so the people actually consuming the tech. I'd love to know where the FinOps Foundation stands. Is it mainly folks, vendors like yourself, or is it mainly end users? Is there a mix of folks going on? I'd love to know a bit more about the FinOps Foundation in general, actually.
Yeah, so I think FinOps Foundation is doing an amazing job of like balancing between the two. So like first and foremost, it's a practitioner kind of space. So it's a place that all FinOps practitioners are organized. Vendors are there as well, but only as contributors. Like there's a Slack channel, and like vendors are like, you can get anyone with a quota in, you can pitch your product, you can do any sales pitch. If you want to participate, great, just do it as a vendor. So I think, vendors have great way of helping that community. So as an example, like we were part of a working group that was organized under the FinOps Foundation that tried to come up with a standard for Kubernetes labeling for cost management solutions. So, part of the stuff that other than like contributing from our knowledge, we ran an analysis on all of our accounts and ran anonymized kind of data set into what people are actually using. So we have the data and we can contribute it for the community to make the community better. So it's a great kind of organization that really helps getting the practitioners together with the vendors in a very neutral kind of environment. And when it makes sense, vendors are giving the stage in order to showcase what they have to offer for practitioners to like choose the right tool when they need to and like understand what's happening there. But it's mostly a practitioner space. They're growing amazingly. There's a FinOps.org website that really organized the entire thing. It keeps on updating. It keeps on, FinOps is something that's live and breathing. And I think for everyone that wants to start with the FinOps journey, FinOps.org is the best place to start.
Fantastic. I'll put that one in the show notes for sure. I did have a look before and I saw there were some certifications there. Are they good? Right? Because I mean, personally, my experience, I did my Java certifications back in the day and I've done my AWS certifications as well. And I found them a really useful learning tool in addition to getting a certificate that then when I go for a job, makes it a bit easier, right? Are the FinOps certifications worth doing, do you think?
Yeah, so they're investing a lot in building certifications. So I think like 2 years ago, there was just one certified FinOps practitioner. And now there's a FinOps professional and there's a bunch of like different trainings for engineers, for finance, for procurement. So it's very interesting to see like how it's evolving. And in general, I think that, obtaining a certificate is a great first place to start. Like the basic certificate, this is a rundown of, the basics. And like if you have the certificate, it's something that people can trust you for like having the basic level of conversation that they want you to have. So I really believe in it, by the way. Like we encourage every FinOut employee to achieve that certification just because you're going to be a better product manager if you get a certification that understands like what your target audience is like working on. And like support engineers in FinOut obtain that certification because when FinOps engineer wants to talk to them, like it's very important for us to like have this kind of sets of terminology. I have a FinOps certified practitioner. I really believe in it. So I think it's a great thing to start. It's a great way to understand like the community that you're getting into. And the more advanced stuff, the FinOps certified professional is like there's a classroom that you need to attend. You need to contribute to the community. And it's like there's very few people that have it. And, those are like the ambassadors that are the best and that they're true professionals that the entire community knows and like can consult with. So I think it's a great thing that you're doing.
Fantastic. I really like what you said there, Roy, about the common language, because I think that's really important. DevOps, I think, struggled for a while and not having that common language. But if you get everyone on your team speaking the same language, magic can happen then, right?
I agree.
Thanks so much for joining me, Roy. It's been a fantastic tour de force, of the sort of 101 level, the getting started of FinOps. Like, I know I'm keen to learn more. I'm bumping into it more and more in the kind of work I do, and definitely we're bumping into it more and more in the InfoQ trend reports as well. So yeah, thank you very much once again for your time, and I really appreciate all the knowledge you've shared.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for hosting me here.